Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
I remember the night as if it were etched into the walls of that dining room, every word and every sideways glance burning hotter than the candles set out for my brother's grand announcement. The table stretched long, heavy with food and polished silver, but heavier still with expectations. My mother had leaned close to me before the toasts began, her nails pressing lightly into my arm in a way that wasn't affectionate at all. She whispered with that sharp smile she always used when she wanted me to obey without a scene, "Stay quiet, don't take his spotlight." It wasn't advice, it was an order dressed up as maternal concern, and I felt it settle in my chest like a weight I already knew too well. I had spent years playing the part of the quiet one, the good daughter who stepped aside when my brother's achievements, or so-called achievements, were paraded like trophies. Birthdays, promotions, graduations, even ordinary dinners somehow turned into stages where he stood under the lights and I, by some unspoken family law, dimmed myself into the shadows. I had told myself I could handle it, that keeping the peace was easier than opening old wounds, but that night, under the golden glow of champagne glasses and polite laughter, I knew I was walking into a trap disguised as a celebration. My brother, Daniel, stood at the head of the table with his fiancée beside him, her dress a shade too bright for the muted room, her smile sharp enough to slice bread. He looked proud, puffed up like he'd been waiting his whole life for this audience. He tapped his glass with a fork, the sound sharp and commanding, silencing the chatter. He launched into his speech, the story of how they met, the fate-filled coincidences, the jokes rehearsed so many times they had lost any hint of spontaneity. People laughed anyway. Our relatives leaned forward with warm smiles, soaking in the glow of his performance. And I sat there, my hands tight around the stem of my glass, trying not to let the bitterness bleed across my face. When he mentioned our parents, thanking them for raising him to be the man he is, my mother beamed like a queen, her eyes darting briefly toward me as though daring me to contradict him. I didn't. I kept my lips pressed closed, reminding myself of the whispered warning. It wasn't worth the fight. It was never worth the fight. But then his fiancée, Claire, shifted slightly, resting a hand on his arm. At first, I thought it was nothing more than the gesture of a woman proud of her moment, ready to share the spotlight she believed she'd earned. Yet the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes swept the table, made my stomach knot. I recognized that look. It wasn't pride, it was preparation. Something inside me stirred uneasily, the same instinct that had saved me more than once when I was younger and learned to sense the storm before anyone else smelled the rain. Daniel lifted his glass higher, ready to deliver what he clearly thought was the perfect closing line, a toast to his future, to their future, to the family we were all supposed to blindly support. And just as the glasses around the table began to rise, Claire's voice cut clean through the moment. "Before we celebrate," she said, her words slow, deliberate, weighted like stones, "there's something you all deserve to know about him." The sound of her interruption hit the room harder than a dropped plate. Every hand froze midair. My brother's smile faltered, the champagne in his glass quivering slightly as if even the bubbles knew the air had shifted. My mother's eyes widened, panic flickering for just a fraction of a second before she smoothed her face back into practiced calm. I felt my breath catch, though I wasn't sure if it was from dread or anticipation. The table was silent, so silent that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the rustle of someone's sleeve against the tablecloth, the small, nervous cough of my uncle who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. Claire kept her gaze steady, her fingers curling tighter around the rim of her glass. She hadn't raised her voice, yet somehow every word carried the kind of weight you can't ignore. I glanced at Daniel. His jaw had set hard, the skin near his temple twitching the way it always did when he felt cornered. For once, he wasn't the man with the microphone, the center of all attention by choice. He was the man pinned by it, stripped of control. And as much as I had promised myself to stay quiet, I couldn't stop the small spark of grim satisfaction that lit up in me. In that instant, I realized I wasn't just a spectator to his shining moment anymore. I was sitting front row to its unraveling. The air around us grew dense, almost suffocating, as though the truth waiting to spill from her lips had already filled the room like smoke. Every face at the table turned toward her, waiting, bracing. And in the pause before she spoke again, before she cracked open whatever secret she carried, I knew nothing in our family was going to look the same after this night. The silence stretched, thick enough to choke on, and then Claire parted her lips as if to finally strike the match. The moment Claire's voice split the room, every polite habit we had rehearsed over years of family dinners tried to drag us back into the script, smile, nod, clap at the right places, yet the script had already caught fire, because she didn't blink, didn't soften her tone, didn't wrap her words in anything sweet, and instead she said, in that almost gentle way people use when they are about to do something brutal, but necessary, that the ring on her hand had been financed through an account she had never opened, that the payments were set to draft from a card she had never applied for, and that the card had been approved with a credit score she had watched collapse over the last 2 months without understanding why until she finally called a live human at the bank and learned that the address on file matched Daniel's lease and the emergency contact on the application was our mother. No one reached for a glass after that, because there is no polite sip for fraud, there is only the metallic taste of shock on your tongue, and as the words passed around the table like a plate of something dangerous, my brother's mouth curved into the kind of smile that looks like a door propped open by force, and he said she must be mistaken, that the jeweler handled the financing, that sometimes names get mixed up, that he had done nothing wrong beyond being too romantic with a timeline, and when our uncle asked if there was any paperwork, Claire nodded once, slid a thin envelope from her purse, and laid down copies of statements that showed charges to a betting app at odd hours, a course with a ridiculous name about winning big if you just up your mindset, and a florist that was not the one who had made the centerpiece wilting on our table. My mother made a soft sound that could have been a warning or a prayer, and she reached for the papers like they might burn a hole in the cloth, telling Claire that misunderstandings happen, that couples figure out finances together, that airing confusion in front of family only gives gossip a stage. Yet the more she spoke, the more the room noticed the part she did not deny, her name as the emergency contact, and I watched the guests' eyes move between my mother's controlled face and my brother's tight jaw, the pendulum of doubt swinging wider with each second of silence that followed. I felt a heat climb my neck, not just from the scandal unfurling, but from the old familiarity of being told to hush while men sorted out the damage they had created, and I tasted the years I had swallowed jokes and the way praise always landed in the same lap. So I kept my mouth closed and let the weight of proof sit there, because the truth did not need my help to breathe, only space, and the space in that room now felt cavernous. Daniel leaned toward Claire with the expensive confidence of a man who had learned that a steady voice makes a lie look like a reasonable explanation, and he told her, with a low calmness, that he would handle the calls in the morning, that these services loved to auto-enroll people, that there was no need to make a scene when the celebration could still be salvaged, and I saw the smallest movement in Claire's face, not a flinch, not relief, but a hardening, as she slid her phone across the table and tapped the screen to open a thread where his number sat above messages instructing her to ignore the notifications. They always fix themselves after the first month, followed by one more line sent the previous week that said, in that careless rhythm Daniel uses when he assumes no one will ever look closely, delete this before Sunday. Chairs creaked, silverware shifted, a cousin coughed, and the centerpieces became something to stare at instead of one another, and my mother tried to retrieve the evening by standing, clinking her spoon against a glass, as if sound alone could knit broken decorum, promising coffee and dessert and a chance to reset, and that word, which I have learned is a favorite of people who never bear the consequences of a reset, scraped down my spine until I recognized the impulse rising in me not as pettiness, but as balance, the need to introduce gravity into a room that had learned to float only when it benefited one person. I did not raise my voice, and I did not announce a grand speech, because I have learned that revenge, when served warm and conversational, lands more precisely than anything flung in anger, so I lifted my napkin, dabbed a corner of my mouth like I was simply preparing to step away for a moment, and asked our cousin, the one who set up the family television for slideshows at holidays, if the wireless screen share was still enabled. Then I tapped my phone and watched the dining room wall flicker from a loop of childhood photos into a folder with a name that sounded harmless, reservations, where the top file opened to a PDF that showed a hall contract for an engagement party, the contact listed as our mother, the deposit paid from an account in her name, and a clause, highlighted in soft yellow by my own fingertip earlier that afternoon, stipulating that in the event of cancellation due to material misrepresentation by the couple, the non-refundable deposit would be held for the sole use of the injured party named on the guest list, which in this contract had been typed as Claire Bennett because I had called the coordinator last week when a different suspicion had nipped at me and suggested a small, protective edit as a surprise for the bride. There was a sound in the room that was almost a laugh and almost a gasp, because humor sometimes arrives disguised as justice, and I let the file sit there in polite, undeniable pixels while I explained, still very gently, that given the confusion, it might be kind to shift control of any deposits to the person currently dealing with bank holds and late fees, and that the coordinator had agreed a bride deserves certainty on her own night, and that I would happily text Claire the login credentials for the venue so she could make any decisions without pressure, which I did, in full view of the table, with the cordial apology of someone fixing a simple administrative oversight. My brother said my name like a warning and then like a plea. My mother's hand went to her pearls because old habits reach for old armor. The cousins whispered in a quick tide, and Claire, whose fingers trembled only once as she looked down at her phone and saw the confirmation emails begin to arrive, raised her glass with a steadiness that did not ask permission, and said she appreciated everyone's patience, that she wanted what was best for the family even if the route was uncomfortable, and that she had one more thing to share when everyone had finished dessert because it did not concern money. Not exactly. Then she set her glass down and slipped a small flash drive from her purse and placed it, very calmly, in the center of the table, where it looked like nothing and everything at once, and she turned her eyes to me with a look that said she knew I would understand what it contained, while my phone buzzed with a message from the venue that began with the words "ownership updated." And the room, suddenly aware that the evening was not done exacting its toll, held its breath as the lights seemed to hum louder and the future, for just a second, felt like a door we were all about to open without knowing what waited on the other side. The flash drive looked like a forgettable pebble in a tide of polished forks and trembling glasses, yet I knew from the way Claire set it down, palm flat for a beat, as if sealing an envelope with a thought, that small things sometimes carry the heft of a falling beam. And when my mother reached to whisk it away with the reflex of someone who has spent a lifetime tidying other people's messes before daylight, I eased it toward me with 2 fingers and the kind of casual smile that says we are just checking the weather, nothing dramatic, no reason for anyone to run, although we all knew that reason had already arrived and was clearing its throat. I plugged the drive into the laptop that usually projects baby photos and talent show disasters, and as the television screen blinked from a screensaver into a simple list of folders, the room shifted into that strained silence people mistake for civility, the one that says as long as we do not gasp, we are still good people, while everyone's eyes widened at the names glowing in clean fonts that never mean clean stories, names like statements, appointments, Seattle, proposals, and one. That made my mother forget her pearls and reach for the remote instead, because she understood better than anyone that a folder labeled "Call with Mom" does not need a lawyer to cause permanent damage. I opened the audio first, not out of cruelty, but out of the practical knowledge that words in a familiar voice accomplish what no spreadsheet can, and the living room filled with the tinny, unmistakable sound of my brother explaining timing. Not the poetry of engagement timing he had puffed up 20 minutes earlier, but the dry arithmetic of locking in a ring and a deposit ahead of her father looking too closely, followed by my mother's low, measured tone advising that any bank questions should be treated like a glitch, that Claire was too nice to embarrass anyone, that what mattered was pushing through the weekend without disruption, and the sound of my brother humming in agreement traveled across the table like a draft from a door left open in winter, making people rub their arms as if the temperature had actually dropped. Daniel barked my name as though he could summon the version of me that used to obey, the one who learned early that silence buys a short-term peace that never pays dividends. And he told everyone that recordings can be taken out of context, that tone is everything. That a person catches only the parts they want to hear, which might have worked on a night without paper trails and late fee emails and a blinking folder titled Statements. That waited like a patient clerk, so I let that folder wait. And opened Proposals instead, where 2 video thumbnails sat side by side with timestamps that made the back of my neck prickle, because nothing writes a headline like 2 ring boxes surfacing in the same month. And the second file name carried a town neither my brother had mentioned to anyone and a date that sidled within a week of a supposedly lost weekend. And while he lunged hands out, voice low, a man begging the fire not to do what fire does, I clicked only enough to make the still image bloom, a candlelit bar, an arm with his watch, a woman's silhouette that was not Claire, and then I pressed pause so hard the button might have recorded my fingerprints. People who love a person will try, even in the face of evidence, to build a bridge out of crumbs, and my aunt did that nobly by suggesting that rehearsal videos can be innocent and that men sometimes practice with friends to get the nerves out. A theory so earnest I wanted to hug her, yet before Daniel could leap onto that raft, Claire reached across the table and set her fingertips on the trackpad with a calm that made me oddly proud, and she dragged the cursor back to the folder list and opened Seattle, which revealed a police incident summary for a traffic stop that had ballooned into a report because a passenger had provided a name that did not match the license in his wallet, and then cracked a joke to the officer about how engagement season makes a man sloppy. A joke so smugly branded with my brother's voice that I did not need the dashcam clip beneath it to feel the shame ripple around the room. I have never loved theater, but I do appreciate timing, and because revenge tastes better when plated with manners, I used the laptop not to scorch earth but to tidy it with a flourish by pulling up the email client already connected to the venue account I had transferred, and I drafted a message with Claire watching. A note to the guest list that the engagement celebration would be shifting formats to a quiet family brunch at a later date, pending some necessary administrative clarifications. Adding a gracious line requesting that any financial gifts be held until the couple issued a new link, not because money was the muscle here, but because power likes to hide in envelopes and I prefer to cut its strings where everyone can see. Then I handed Claire the keyboard and let her hit send while my mother sat stunned by the sight of Control walking off in a dress that was not hers. Daniel tried levity because charm had saved him before, tossing a line about how modern relationships were too dependent on screens, and how none of this represented the man he really was when you looked him in the eyes. And I almost admired the audacity until I remembered rooms I had left early to avoid becoming a punchline, so I closed the laptop with the same gentle click one uses for a well-made jewelry box, and told him, with a smile that did not ask for debate, that he could tell us who he really was on a night when the truth did not have to compete with cake. Then I slid the flash drive back across the table to Claire like a baton in a relay she had already started to win, and I said I would walk her to her car after dessert, not because I feared a scene, but because some exits deserve a witness. The cousins began to gather plates, the room tried to return to its old rhythm and failed, and I thought for a second the night had found a strange equilibrium, until Claire touched my wrist and asked, almost softly, whether I had ever seen the folder named Contracts, which I had not noticed because spectacle tends to distract from the paperwork that does the real damage, and when I opened it I found a neat little PDF labeled with my full name and a draft cosign agreement prepared for a move. In lease at an address I did not recognize, a pre-filled signature line waiting in confident silence, and a note in the margin that read in my brother's clipped shorthand, "Send for her by Monday," which made the room tilt just enough that I had to steady my glass, while my mother, finally finding her voice, said my name as if she were saying a prayer or a warning, and the lights flickered once as the central air kicked in, and I realized the party was ending, but the fight had just introduced its real terms. The discovery of that contract with my name already scrawled in a forged approximation of my signature did something far sharper than any recording or grainy video ever could. because it made clear that Daniel's carelessness was not confined to reckless indulgences or shady attempts at financing. It was deliberate enough to carve my identity into a scaffolding of lies, leaving me tethered to a plan I had never agreed to, a future that would have collapsed over me without a single warning. My mother's voice, so steady all night even in denial, broke when she saw it, not in a sob but in a tremor of disbelief, the kind that sounded like she had finally glimpsed the edge of her own complicity. And for one fleeting second her eyes met mine as though she wanted me to confirm that she hadn't known, that she hadn't allowed this particular violation, yet the silence between us said everything. Daniel lunged to shut the laptop, nearly tipping the water glasses in his path, muttering that documents get mixed, that digital files are easy to forge, that I of all people should understand how jealous partners or disgruntled employees fabricate evidence for leverage, but the desperation made his voice crack, the pitch slipping higher. And the audience of relatives who once would have smoothed over his blunders now looked at him with a skepticism I had never seen granted to me in all the years I begged them to take my side. I sat back, watching the performance, and felt the old, familiar instruction in my mother's whisper, "Stay quiet. Don't take his spotlight," dissolve inside me like sugar in hot coffee, replaced by something firmer, steadier, the knowledge that if I said nothing, the next forged line could cost me far more than pride. I stood slowly, because drama belongs to those who wield it without haste, and I told everyone gathered that while Daniel was correct in one regard, digital files can be faked, they can also be verified in ways beyond any sibling squabble. And that before dinner I had already forwarded copies of everything from the flash drive to my attorney, who would in turn be contacting the bank and the venue and anyone else whose names had appeared across the evidence we were staring at. It wasn't entirely true. I had only drafted the email, but truth is sometimes best when sharpened with suggestion, and the way Daniel paled told me he believed it more thoroughly than anyone else. The family shifted, murmuring, the polite structure of the evening long gone, and my mother finally found her footing in anger, lashing out not at Daniel, not at Claire, but at me, as though I had conjured the mess by refusing to keep it buried. She accused me of humiliating the family, of ruining what could have been salvaged with discretion, of behaving with vindictiveness instead of loyalty, and her words rang with that old, cruel irony. That silence in our family was always mistaken for love, while truth was branded as treachery. I let her rail, not because I had nothing to say, but because letting her show her hand was more powerful than any retort I could make, and sure enough, the relatives who had once hung on her every assurance were now staring at her with the dawning realization that she had known more than she would ever admit. Claire rose then, her hand brushing mine briefly in an acknowledgement that felt like an alliance forged in the unlikeliest of battles, and she said clearly, with a steadiness that surprised even me, that there was no salvaging a future built on signatures stolen, debts buried, and affections scattered across cities like loose coins. She removed the ring with deliberate slowness, set it beside her untouched dessert plate, and told Daniel that while she had thought exposing him would break her, she now felt lighter than she had in months, because the truth, however brutal, freed her from the endless work of pretending he was a man she could trust. Daniel tried to laugh, that familiar laugh that had so often been his weapon, too loud, too forced, a signal that anyone who didn't join in was humorless or cruel, but no one echoed it. He threw his napkin onto the table, muttering about betrayal, about women who conspire, about families too weak to defend their own, and then stormed toward the door with such force the chandelier quivered overhead. My mother half rose to follow, but I caught her eye and said, with a calm I barely recognized as my own, that maybe for once she should let him walk alone, because coddling him to the car would not erase the trail of ashes he had left behind. The door slammed, the sound reverberating through the dining room like a final gavel strike, and the guests slowly exhaled, the tension dripping off them in nervous glances and murmured excuses to leave early. I stayed standing, finishing my glass with the satisfaction of someone who knows the spotlight has finally shifted, not by accident, but by design. Claire leaned close as the room emptied and whispered that she had one last thing for me, something she hadn't wanted to unveil in front of them all, and she pressed a folded note into my palm before walking out into the night, her heels clicking against the floor like punctuation marks to a sentence I hadn't yet read. I slipped the note into my pocket without opening it, because sometimes the thread of revelation carries more power than the revelation itself, and as I watched my mother sit alone at the far end of the table, hands twisting in her lap, I realized revenge had been served not with fire, but with patience and precision. The only question left was whether the note in my pocket contained a conclusion to the evening's spectacle, or an opening to something far more dangerous that had only just begun. I waited until the last dish had been carried into the kitchen and the clatter of plates had faded into the kind of silence that makes a house feel older than it is, then slipped into the hallway where the lighting dimmed and the noise of voices no longer reached. My hand went to the pocket where the folded note rested, light as paper but heavy with promise, and I knew that reading it would change the shape of the evening, perhaps even the shape of the story my family would tell about me for years to come. I stood there for a long moment, hearing the murmur of my mother's voice in the dining room as she attempted, against all evidence, to knit together some explanation for the disaster. While the cousins whispered their goodbyes and the aunts pulled coats over their shoulders, eager to leave before any more truths found a way into the open. When I finally unfolded the paper, the words were not many, yet they were chosen with precision. Claire's handwriting slanted just slightly, confident but quick, as though written in a moment when hesitation would have undone her resolve. She had written that Daniel's lies had not stopped with finances or phantoms of fidelity. There was a deeper account, one she had uncovered only days before, tucked away in an email chain between him and an associate she did not recognize, discussing the transfer of funds through my name, documents prepared in my stead, and the suggestion that when everything collapsed, it would be easier to claim that I had been complicit, the loyal sister who signed papers without reading them. Beneath that, she had written only 2 words: "Be ready." I read it twice, 3 times, each pass making my breath heavier, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had always known deep down, that my brother's sense of entitlement did not stop at stealing my spotlight, my moments, my recognition, but had now graduated to something colder, a plan to make me a shield for his recklessness. The letter did not reveal dates or amounts, only hints, enough to show me that what had been displayed tonight was merely the surface of a deeper rot. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel like the younger sibling scrambling to keep pace, nor the silenced daughter asked to take her mother's scolding like scripture, but the one holding evidence, leverage, and the possibility of retribution carefully balanced in her hands. I slipped back into the dining room, and though most of the guests had left, the remnants of the party still sprawled across the table, plates smeared with sauce, glasses fogged with fingerprints, candles burned low as though they had run out of breath. My mother sat rigid, her back too straight for comfort, her eyes scanning me the way a commander studies the horizon for incoming threats. She asked, in a voice that trembled despite her attempt at authority, what Claire had given me, and I told her nothing of the letter, only that some truths are better discovered slowly, that rushing to explain them ruins the taste of revelation. Her face hardened, and for once she seemed to recognize that I had grown beyond the reach of her whispered warnings, that I would not fold my edges back into neat obedience. Later, alone in my room, I set the letter on the desk beneath the glow of a single lamp and considered what to do next. Part of me wanted to call Claire, to thank her, to ask why she had trusted me with this last shard of truth, but another part of me understood that gratitude was not what she sought. She had given me something larger than thanks could cover. She had passed me the match that could ignite the rest of Daniel's careful facade, the kindling he had built from my name, my silence, and my mother's protection. I thought of the venue's deposit already shifted, the emails already sent, the relatives already whispering in their cars as they drove home, and I realized that tonight had been less an ending than a staging ground. For the first time, I saw my brother not as the golden child who eclipsed me, nor as the petty manipulator I had long resented, but as an opponent who had underestimated me. A man who believed I would never dare to use the weight of his own words against him. Perhaps he was still laughing somewhere, convinced that a single slammed door could erase the trail of evidence behind him. Perhaps my mother was sitting in her room rehearsing excuses she might deliver tomorrow, telling herself that families survive because they forget, not because they confront. But I had no intention of forgetting, not this time. I folded the letter once more and slipped it into an envelope, sealing it with tape rather than trust, then placed it in the drawer with my passport and the few documents that truly mattered. It would not stay hidden for long. I had no desire to parade it before strangers or to humiliate my brother in tabloids, but I wanted him to know, when the time came, that his plan had failed because I was no longer the girl who stayed quiet. I was prepared, I was armed with his own carelessness, and I was ready to strike when the moment would matter most. The clock ticked toward midnight, the house finally still, and I thought about Claire walking away without her ring, but with her dignity, about my mother gripping her pearls as though they could hold back time, and about my brother, somewhere in the dark, still convinced he could outrun accountability. I smiled, not in triumph but in anticipation, because revenge is never a single night's work. It is a long patience, a quiet strategy, and sometimes a simple piece of paper tucked into an envelope waiting for the right hour. And as I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, I understood that the story was not closing, only shifting chapters, and that the next one would not be written at my expense.